Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for Protecting Gender Identity and Expression for America's Youth, the inaugural panel in the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network and Ms. Foundation for Women's three-part speaker series on the fight for gender justice. My name is Melissa Murray. I'm the Frederick I. and Grace Stokes Professor of Law at NYU Law, and I'm also the faculty director of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network here at the law school. We are thrilled to see such a terrific turnout this evening, an audience filled with law students, practitioners, and anyone interested in this very important topic. The Birnbaum Women's Leadership Institute at NYU is a center at the law school that works to remedy gender inequities in the legal profession through innovative leadership training and conversations just like this one. Initially founded to serve as a hub for gender equity issues at the law school, the BWLN has evolved to focus on a range of different issues and to provide a forum for discussing how women's rights and sexism and gender inequality intersect with legal issues more broadly. Through events like this speaker series, the BWLN brings top thought leaders together to discuss how and why these problems persist, but more importantly, to discuss how we can fix them. We are delighted to partner in this speaker series with the Ms. Foundation for Women, which aims to build women's collective power in the United States to advance equity and justice for all, and to work toward a world in which power and possibility are not limited by gender, race, class, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, or age. The thinking behind this speaker series is to highlight legal battles at the forefront of inclusive gender rights on the national stage, through convening thought leaders from across advocacy organizations, government, and the legal field to discuss cutting-edge issues and how activists, attorneys, and elected officials can work together to protect gender rights and advance gender justice. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to acknowledge the hard work of the BWLN's administrative team, including our executive director, Abigail Seidner, who is currently on parental leave, but was instrumental in putting this series together. I'm also grateful to our interim executive director, Madeline Jory, our assistant director, Claire Whitman, our research assistant, Shruti Kannan, and our founding supporters, Sheila Birnbaum and Sarah Moss, for all of their hard work on this program and their ongoing support of the BWLN. We are also grateful to Ruth McFarland, the Ms. Foundation's Chief Advancement Officer and tonight's moderator, as well as Stephanie Blackwood, the Senior Director of Engagement and Major Gifts at the Ms. Foundation, and basically the Ms. Foundation's complete and total efforts in developing this program and bringing it to us. And we are very excited to be partnering with them. So many thanks to the Ms. Foundation and especially Teresa Younger, the Foundation's President and CEO. Finally, we are very grateful to NYU's law students, particularly Outlaw, which is a co-sponsor for tonight's panel. Finally, for those of you who are seeking New York State CLE credit for this event, please record all of the CLE attendance verification codes that are announced during the program. Those will be announced live, and there will also be indicators in the chat. Following the program, attendees will receive a link to an attorney affirmation and evaluation form. To earn CLE credits, all you have to do is complete the form and enter all of the CLE codes that were announced during tonight's program. So as we begin, I am pleased now to welcome Sam Ames, who is the Director of Advocacy and Government Affairs at the Trevor Project. Sam previously worked at the National Center for Lesbian Rights before receiving a Master of Theological Studies at the National Center from Harvard, After graduation, they worked as a hospital chaplain in San Francisco and as the interim director of Trans Lifeline. We're so glad to have Sam here this evening to formally introduce this panel and to set the stage for tonight's discussion. So over to you, Sam. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I was so honored today to be asked to introduce some of my actual heroes in the movement for LGBTQ rights, who you're going to hear from. Ruth asked me to start tonight off by leaning a little bit into the aspect of this work that we sometimes overlook in this race towards civil and human rights, which is what it means that every one of the folks that you're going to hear from tonight has dedicated their lives not just to the law, but to actual real human beings. You just heard my very weird resume. And so you know that one of the places from which I come to this work is actually theology. I was raised in the Unitarian Universalist Church, which is an open and accepting faith tradition. My partner is a minister and a womanist scholar. The third member of my family is a minister and Yiddish scholar. And I am right now, because I'm moving, literally in a room surrounded by books on liberation theology, surrounded. And what I learn over and over from these communities is that service is bound up with listening. About 7 years ago, I was lucky enough to have the National Center for Lesbian Rights, which is well represented on this call, support me in creating this campaign called Born Perfect. Its mission was to end conversion therapy, sometimes something that at the time very few people were working on or funding. And in those first few years, still, we made some pretty incredible progress, which has been built on in huge ways by some of our brilliant colleagues since I left in 2016. And I can remember this night that I realized I had to leave. Around 2 a.m., I got a call from a survivor of conversion therapy who was in crisis. They were close to suicide, and they made the incredibly brave decision to reach out for help. And that night wasn't terribly rare. It happens frequently in that work. But it was the night I realized how frequently. It was this night I realized I was answering more calls in the middle of the night than drafting briefs during the day. And the night that I realized I hadn't been trained for any of that. I was a decent enough listener, but at the end of the day, I didn't fully understand what I was listening to. And I knew I needed to serve people better. So I made the very hard decision to leave and got a degree in theology with a specialization in religious trauma. I served that year as a hospital chaplain, primarily on an inpatient psychiatric unit, listening to the stories of this largely queer patient population in San Francisco, one which linked mental illness to poverty and economic justice in a way that I don't think anyone who does that work can ever unlink. And when a call came from Trans Lifeline that they needed an executive director, I laughed and told them how sweet they were to think I was in any way qualified for that, and that thank you, but I was in the middle of learning how to listen. And this fierce sex worker rights organizer on the other end of the line very lovingly shot back at me that I needed to listen to her because this wasn't about a job, it was about service. The reason I just ran my mouth off about me for a second is that I know when I talk about service in a context, especially after I've been introduced as having a degree in theology, there is this urge to interpret it as about demoting yourself in some kind of hierarchical relationship or weaponized dogma. But really, at its best, it's about humility. It's a practice of remembering to look into the eyes of the people we're listening to, remembering to speak with rather than speak for, and remembering that our work as lawyers, the names on either side of that V are just as important as the case. But remembering not just Bostock, Sarda, and Harris Funeral Homes, a list of cases most of us have gotten so good at reciting that they become one word, but the names. And I wanted to talk about those cases in particular as we are discussing these intersections between sex discrimination and gender identity, in part because the backlash we're seeing after progress in LGBTQ rights against trans youth in particular is also one we saw play out in the fight for women's empowerment and still do. One of the primary things these decisions relied on was obviously this case, PricewaterhouseCoopers v. Hopkins, which held that Title VII's prohibition on sex discrimination included sex stereotypes. And when they did that, the Supreme Court acknowledged in this tiptoey and restrained way that there is a link between rigid gender roles and something that is not just. It is notable, I think, that we call that case PricewaterhouseCoopers, not Hopkins. We don't talk so much about Ann Hopkins, who incidentally created an entirely new mathematical model to protect the satellites that predict extreme weather for storm warning systems. We talk about how brash and unfeminine she was because it makes our point that those qualities wouldn't be held against her if she were a man, which is true. But we also don't know that while she was sitting in legal offices like ours and pursuing a case that we all know can be life-consuming as a plaintiff, she was also raising 3 kids as a single parent. I don't know how often her lawyers looked into her eyes. I hope often. But I do know that I didn't learn any of that in law school. The legal issue was so critical, it was really easy for the facts of the case to overshadow the story of that person. Unlike PricewaterhouseCoopers v. Hopkins, the name of the plaintiff behind Harris Funeral Homes v. EEOC does not appear in the case title. It's Amy Stevens. Amy was born in Fayetteville, North Carolina. She actually got a combination of degrees a lot of my theological colleagues do, religion and mortuary science. At first glance, I know that sounds like kind of a red flag. But in my experience, funeral work is just another form of what I got to do in the hospital, something it's actually very difficult to do with any kind of religious agenda. It is sitting with someone on the worst day of their life and talking about how to wake up to an absolutely unfathomable next day. And I will tell you now, when I did it, it was one of the greatest honors of my life to do that work, but I could not do it forever. It takes a really particular kind of person. I lasted 10 months before I got called into Trans Lifeline, and I can't say there wasn't this little part of me that was relieved. Amy did that work for 20 years. And there were times that she thought about suicide, which is an understandable reaction, but incredibly, it wasn't from the weight of the work. She was living a life she knew was not hers. And so 6 years into her job at Harris Funeral Home, she sat down and she wrote a letter to her boss that she had gathered the courage to transition. And we all know what happened. 2 weeks later, they fired her. And in another act of courage, knowing it would have to be followed by so many more, she hired a lawyer. And ultimately, several people on this call who you are going to hear from tonight, notably Taylor Brown over at the ACLU. It took 6 years for Amy's case to make it to the Supreme Court, and the better part of another year before they ruled in her favor and in the favor of every trans person in the country, which was not, I think, what a lot of us expected. Amy did not live to see that day. She died on May 12th, 2020, just a month before the decision. She died at 59 of pancreatic cancer, which is a hard death, and one that notably trans people are less likely to receive competent care for or survive. She died not knowing whether the court would even call her by her name. And I think I'm probably not the only one on this call who absolutely lost it and cried when she did, partly because being seen matters so much, but partly because being seen is so not enough. The bar is unspeakably low. At the Trevor Project, I run our national trans advocacy. And right now, trans youth are being used as a tool to promote a political agenda that has nothing to do with them. There are 100 reasons we know that these bills banning them from sports aren't really about sports, starting with the fact that they hired me, whose game knowledge pretty much ends with Settlers of Catan. What it is about is a deeply cynical view of electoral politics, and more importantly, about whether we should be permitted to exist. I work at an organization whose mission is rooted, at least in part, in an awareness of death. It's actually hard not to remember our ancestors, whether they're 59, like Amy was, or 4, a number I really wish I were making up. Values are rooted in crisis services, and the advocacy team, which I am a part of, has no choice but to ground its work in that listening, which as a lawyer is humbling. You are forced to remember every day you come to work that service is more important than victory, and that is not what we learn in law school. We learn to tease out the facts that win the case and cut the ones that don't. And I won't lie and say I didn't have to look up Ann Hopkins' story. I was taught to read more than I was to listen. Right now, we are living through a moment when our dominant culture is being taken to task for not listening. And the voices that have been silenced are rightly insisting on the right to be listened to. Ultimately, on the right to exist. The day that Bostock, Zarda, and Harris were decided, the Supreme Court did a couple of other things. That day, it also declined to take up a case on qualified immunity, a doctrine that shields police officers from accountability for constitutional violations that very well could have ended up exonerating Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. It also failed to protect trans people from harassment in public places and accommodations. It left wide open the possibility that legal protections can be erased by religious exemption. And it couldn't even bring itself to say the word bisexual, a group that faces one of the highest rates of violence in the nation. And we know exactly how those things are going to combine to rob our communities of life. The day we won that case, the day that Amy Stevens didn't live to see, has to be a reminder that law and justice are not the same. And that as lawyers, we are first and foremost service of justice. Today, these lawyers are going to talk to you about justice and how they are servants of justice and about the ways they are raising the bar. And as they do, and when you leave this Zoom room, this bizarre reminder of the conditions that are decimating the mental health of the most vulnerable right now, I invite you to hold in the forefront of your mind not just what they're talking about, but who. The names on either side of the V. The people who fight to tell the stories. And remember, not only that our work is service, but that so was theirs, and so is theirs. And with that, I could not be more honored to introduce you to some of the people in this movement who best embody the value of that service. Thank you so much for letting me be here on screen today with a bunch of rock stars. And I will start with the great Ruth McFarland. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Sam. That was amazing. Thank you so much, Professor Murray, for kicking us off, and Sam for really helping us to kind of see some of the technical stuff we're about to dig into with this panel of rock stars in a human light. So I am Ruth McFarland. As you've heard, I'm the Chief Advancement Officer at the Ms. Foundation for Women. We are delighted to be doing this with the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network at NYU Law. And Ms. has been around for some time. We're almost 50, and we've been doing this work of building the collective power of women over many, many iterations and change, not just in the feminist movement, but in many movements. And today we really see our work at the intersection of gender and race. And that's sort of where I situate as well. I'm a lawyer. I'm also a trained social worker, which I did after law school. A very unusual twist, I think. And for the past 10 years, my career has really been focused on gender and racial equity, especially LGBTQ justice. So today, and I'm going to ask them to turn their cameras on, I'm here with 4 of the leading advocates in the fight for gender justice for youth, specifically transgender youth. And in a moment, I'll do a quick introduction of them, and we will start to dig into the numerous sites of attack on gender identity for young people. We're going to spend most of our time in that conversation, and then I'm hoping, time permitting, that we'll get a chance to talk a little bit about community responses, a little bit about their experience as practitioners. As you've heard, this is being offered for CLE credit. You will get a code later in the session. And there's also a Q&A chat availability down in the bottom of your screen. So if you have questions for the panel or for me during the course of this presentation, please do populate that space. I will be keeping an eye on it. And if I'm able to weave your question into our conversation, I will. Time permitting, I'll hopefully be able to raise up a few of those at the end of the panel conversation. And for my panelists, we do have a lot of law students and lawyers in the audience, but we have folks who don't have law backgrounds. So as we're going through, just be mindful that you are speaking to a mixed audience, and I will try to track for that too, and bring us along together. Feel free to take yourselves off mute, and I'm gonna do some quick intros. First of all, absolutely thrilled to have Taylor Brown, staff attorney with the LGBTQ and HIV project of the ACLU, here with us today. And Taylor, thank you for joining us on short notice at a very extremely busy time for you. And I'm sure that the busyness is true for everyone on the panel, but I especially wanted to thank you. Haley Gorenberg, legal director of the New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. Haley, thank you. Andy Mara, executive director at Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. Andy, thank you for joining us. And lastly, but not least, my friend Asaf Orr, senior staff attorney and transgender youth project director at the National Center for Lesbian Rights. Thank you all for being here. I want to start with a question to kind of get us into your work, and that is, tell us a little bit about yourselves and tell us how you're involved in fighting for gender justice for youth today. And I want to start with you, Taylor, if that's okay.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Taylor Brown. So a little about me. Let's see here. Well, I'm originally from North Carolina, as I always tell people. So I am a Southern girl committed to working in the South, as that is where a lot of our community needs the most help. I'm a trans woman. I'm also a biracial Black woman. And yes, I grew up in the South in a dire socioeconomic situation, and my father was incarcerated. So all of these factors, ultimately, I became the first in my family to go to college and then on to law school. And so I've always been very interested in the intersection of socioeconomic status, race, and of course, LGBT status, and just having to fight for those things for myself as a younger person. It naturally translated into a career in the law, I think. And so as I brought myself to, my first job was at Lambda Legal, where I worked with Haley, and then at the ACLU, that's where I concentrate my work. And so I do a lot of work in healthcare for transgender people, but I'm also, as we're talking about tonight, counsel on 2 of our sports cases in states that have enacted sports bans that are targeting trans youth for participation in school sports, interscholastic sports in federally funded schools. And so, yes, so healthcare is my passion. It has changed my life. It is something that is central to trans people's lives. And there is so much injustice in the healthcare system. And so that is where I really like to focus a lot of my work. But I consider myself a generalist and handle a variety of matters. And again, always at the heart of it are trans people and sort of the ways that the law impacts them, often in a negative way, and trying to correct that.
Thank you so much, Taylor. Andy, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, the work you're doing now?
My name is Andy Mara. It is a pleasure to be here with you all. My pronouns are she and her. And I am the executive director of TILDEF, the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. And in thinking about gender justice and young people, particularly that impacts transgender people, I think about my roots and where I came from. I think for a lot of folks of my generation, we were the ones that were founding or co-founding GSAs in our high schools. We were the ones that were getting involved in our PFLAG or GLSEN chapters, and my story is no different. At 15 or 16, I was starting to articulate who I was as a queer person, as a trans woman of color. And part of that work started out as an organizer and organizing on the statewide level here in New York State. And that's followed me throughout my years of activism in the broader queer and trans movement. I will also admit that the folks in the audience who are not attorneys, you are in good company, as I am not an attorney myself. But the work that we do at TILDF is largely centered on, I think, what Sam was referencing in their opening remarks around service. I think all of us on staff at TILDF adopt a model and adopt an approach around servant leadership and lifting up those in our community who are often most pushed to the margins. That includes Black and brown trans women, that includes poor trans folks, that includes trans folks that live in rural communities, that also includes young people and our elders. I'm thinking about what we have been up to as an organization. I think a lot of what Taylor shared rings true for us at TILDF. For us at our organization, we focus a lot of our work around healthcare access, particularly as it pertains to insurance coverage. We've moved on a few matters, federal matters for that, to be clear, in North Carolina and Georgia, as it pertains to making sure that trans folks, particularly covered under public employee healthcare plans, are not denied coverage. Taylor, I think when you were at Lambda, you were working on that matter with NOAA. In addition to that, we also are focused on making sure that trans and non-binary folks can easily and legally change their names and gender markers. Much of that work, I think, most recently has occurred in New York, where the Gender Recognition Act passed, and the state is now, among other things, not only has removed a bunch of arcane barriers to legally changing your name, but also recognizes a third gender on state documentation. New Jersey just removed, with the work of their state Supreme Court, removed barriers to legally changing your trans folks' names. And then I think the last thing I'll lift up too is that we've also been operating in a climate where trans and non-binary folks have been forced to not only deal with day-to-day survival-based needs and in the midst of a pandemic. And a lot of our work over the past year and a half or so has been focused on making sure that trans people can legally change their names, have the right information to file complaints if they are denied coverage or care, or even denied public benefits. And it's been a rough year and a half for trans and non-binary folks, in addition to the day-to-day work that we do at TILDF. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Andy. Haley, how did you come to this work, and what's your work really about today?
Sure. I think that one of the core animating and earliest animating factors for me was anti-bullying and wanting people to have dignity and safety in their lives. And that very quickly attached to the effect of gender norming, which is actually often violent, whether it's attacks in the street or healthcare denials or the imposition of something under the guise of healthcare. And whether it's through 15 years of work at Lambda Legal or currently teaching LGBTQ rights at NYU, or in the work that I do at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, I really try to sort of go at those factors that allow for essentially sort of legalized bullying in the law. So for instance, I look to the experience of intersex children and infants who have surgeries imposed upon them that change their lives, may sterilize them, have profound consequences with no medical need, and obviously not their consent. and then trans people who are fully capable of consenting to medical care that they need, and it's entirely backed up and verified, and the kids are getting surgeries and the trans people are not getting what they need. And how can this be happening? Well, I think that the animating principle is gender norming, that's what's happening here. So we continue to encounter these things. They're not just historical. In terms of the work at in my current practice at New York Lawyers, we are entirely community driven, and harm reduction, intersections of health, learnings from the work for the civil rights of people living with HIV in terms of harm reduction, that is all still in full flower and important to keep in mind for the communities that we partner with. And I'm always looking to build in the intersections. So part of our practice, for instance, is addressing the dangers in immigration detention for people who are transgender, nonconforming, and intersex and have health conditions that are very serious and jeopardize their health when they're in danger of detention or in detention. So looking at those intersections is absolutely key, and looking at them through a lens of gender oppression, all with a goal, and that's been throughout my career, of lived justice, so that whatever we're doing and pursuing, it's being felt by the community. We're not pursuing paper wins, we're pursuing actual impact. And I know we're going to discuss walking while trans, and I actually am not sure whether you wanted to be cueing that for me now or whether I'm
Let's cue it for a little bit later.
Okay.
Thanks. Asaf, share with us how you got here and what you're working on now at NCLR.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me this evening. As I like to say, for more than a decade, I've been advocating for the little t in LGBT because I work exclusively on youth issues, and that has really, much like Taylor and others on this call, has led me to be a generalist. Although I started in this work focusing largely on education, because I do see education as something that can really change the life trajectories of young people. It's certainly not the only thing. And I'm currently working on cases around healthcare discrimination. In particular, we're suing the state of Arizona for having an exclusion in their state Medicaid plan that excludes coverage for sex reassignment surgeries. And we're representing a transgender teenager in that case who's been denied coverage for top surgery. And another major case that I'm working on is a case involving access to birth certificates, also in Arizona. Arizona requires surgery to change a birth certificate through their private administrative process, which is a huge barrier for all trans people, but in particular for transgender young people who need their birth certificates to be corrected earlier in their life so they can live their life as who they are. And then I think the other kind of bucket of cases that I'm working on now is kind of the cases involved is kind of related to the backlash that we're seeing, right? Taylor talked a bit about sort of and Andy talked about the attack on transgender young people legislatively, which is awful and ongoing. But there's also been this backlash in courts, for example, educators who are seeking an exemption from school anti-discrimination policies that protect transgender students in their schools, saying that they have a free speech and free exercise right to mistreat or discriminate against transgender students. So involved in several of those cases as well. I think one of the unique things about my practice, and I'm sure others on this call can say the same, is that we're not just doing this sort of work affirmatively on behalf of individuals, but we're also constantly in consultation with organizations. For example, I've worked with sports organizations on developing trans-inclusive policies. I've worked with schools on developing trans-inclusive policies and training. So we're really, going back to Sam's initial point, really our North Star is justice. And working towards justice is not just representing individual people in impact cases, but also going where the work takes you. And if you're being, contacted by organizations or public entities or other folks who want to do good work but need that support, that's where you go.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. And so we've got a little flavor from even just those introductions on the fairly broad scope of issues that fit under the umbrella of really addressing gender justice for transgender youth today. But I want to really now, through a series of questions, dig into the many types of laws and policies that are threatening our young people, specifically, around gender-specific facilities, the sports bans, the restrictions on access to healthcare, the restrictions around identity documents. And so what I'm going to do now is just kind of hopefully, with some directed questions, give you all the opportunity to unpack some of that. And what I want to do, Andy, is actually start with you and take us back to what I understand to be the beginning of the litigation story around many of these issues, and that is with the case, Coy Mathis's case. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the work Tildef did there and that case.
Yeah, so in 2013, let's rewind and go back into the past. In 2013, Tildef received a call from the Mathis family, and it was in regards to their then 6-year-old trans daughter, Coy. Coy was entering first grade, and she was just like any other first grader. She was loved to play with her friends and loved going to school. And what's important to note about Coy is that not only was she a young trans girl, but she grew up in a home with parents that affirmed her gender identity. In fact, was able to secure identification, state identification, as well as a passport that reflected her true name and her gender. And when the parents reached out to the school district and let them know that Coy was a girl of trans experience, the school district initially responded and said, you know what, we'll figure this out. We want to make sure that Coy can thrive. The school district, however, abruptly made the decision to segregate Coy from certain activities and certain school facilities, namely bathroom access. And Coy was Coy's parents were essentially told that their daughter could only use the bathroom in the teacher's lounge or the bathroom located in the nurse's office. And Coy's parents were very adamant in saying, like, look, our daughter deserves access to be able to use the girls' restroom, just like any other girl at school. And the school district said, sorry, we can't do that. I think it's important to note, because I don't want to just get hung up in talking about the law, that this had a direct emotional impact on Coy. 6 years old, and she already could identify and articulate transphobic experiences at school, where her peers were calling her and referring to her as a boy, and her teachers were starting to refer to her as a boy, and singling her out and putting her into male spaces. So as a result, Tildef filed a complaint with the Colorado Civil Rights Division. It was an administrative matter, and for the first time ever in the country, the Civil Rights Division of Colorado ruled that Coy should be granted access to the girls' facility just like any other young girl attending a public school. And what's worth noting too is that the division specifically named that the school district was trying to employ a separate but equal policy, and that those rarely work. And this was also around the time that there was a 15-year-old, then 15-year-old trans girl in Maine, Nicole Maines, who is also experiencing similar barriers in accessing restrooms. And so this Coy and Nicole subsequently were really the first cases that we saw in raising awareness about trans young people, the barriers that they face in schools and school-related facilities. And specific to Coy, this was an exciting ruling in that this was the first time that a trans young person was essentially recognized as who they are and being recognized and having equal access to the facility that adheres to their gender identity.
Thank you. And it is, I think, really important then to go from that sort of story and that beginning to think a little bit together about what we've seen in terms of like this onslaught of awful, awful, awful laws in years since. And Haley, I'm wondering if I can turn to you next, and I'm going to give you this one off the cuff, but could you give us some perspective on the number of laws? Like, what have we seen for folks who haven't been watching this maybe as closely as you all obviously have been? What have we seen happen in the legislative space around the identity of transgender young people?
So it's in an absolute onslaught, hundreds of laws proposed, many of them passed throughout the country. And we saw rafts upon rafts of them a few years ago, specifically targeting bathroom access. And then I would say, with some success beating it back, but we don't have the ability to have confidence in this because people are being so targeted. Then we saw sort of an additional attempt to bring in this new layer of laws targeting young people who are trans, who might be interested in being on athletics teams that are sex tagged or gender tagged. And I would say the through line is using these targeted efforts to disadvantage people who they're like not as well known. It's a wedge issue, specifically targeting trans people and gender non-conforming young people, maybe non-binary or gender fluid, and being used to gin up a homophobic and transphobic base for other purposes. And I think that we have to see through that, see it for what it is, and that there are a couple of things that make it clear. For one thing, some of these legislators who are proposing the laws, when asked if they actually know somebody who fits the bill, who's trying to access a sports team or what have you, that's gender tagged, they'll admit that they don't know anybody in their state who is trying such a thing. The people who are pushing these laws generally have no attachment to the rights of women or girls or their safety, dignity, or health historically. But now this is emerging as their cause célèbre, supposedly justified by their abiding interest in the health and well-being of cisgender women and girls. I think most of them don't know the language around cisgender, but supposedly pledging that that's their concern and that that's why they are doing this. And so in addition to recognizing these for what they are, I never leave this topic without saying that those of us who are cisgender, any of us who are cisgender women, need to stand up and say, not in our name. All right.
Exactly.
And not in our name. This is not making me safer. Don't use me to justify it. It is hateful. It is discrimination. And I have two cisgender daughters. I say, like, you're not making me safer. I didn't ask for this. You're not making them safer. And I've educated my daughters from when they were young kids to be very clear that that is not something that they need or they're asking for. So I really think that we have to take on, as cisgender women and girls, that this will not be done in our name, and we're going to speak up about it and make sure that that doesn't happen on our watch.
Thank you. Yes, hear, and thank you. And I want to go from there actually to Taylor and have you tell us a little bit about, athletics is a contested space for transgender athletes, but it's a contested space around gender in general. And so I know that your work has been, as you said, this has been one of the focuses of your work. Can you tell us a little bit about what's at stake in these cases? And, to the extent that you want to share about a particular case, that would be great as well.
Absolutely. I mean, as Haley was saying, so the people who are pushing these laws do not know trans people. They are often reciting Christianity and their support for these things. And it just comes from a space of not what they're purporting to do, and that's protect cisgender girls from whatever, protect opportunities in the sports that are related to scholastic opportunities, and so those sort of things really make me sort of think about why it's important for trans kids to be able to participate in sports in accordance with their gender identity, and that's because, again, when we think about what sports are at that level, there's so many benefits to, well, I hate to say children, but to youth. And so it's teamwork, it is exercise, it is building character, it is making friends, all of these things. And, there are tons of studies that show the benefits of participating on sports teams in terms of later advancement in life, in terms of higher education and employment and things like that. And ultimately, what's at stake is that these kids are just having fun. These kids are not going to be Olympians. These kids are not going to the NFL. And I know that's hard to tell your child sometimes, but I like to keep it very real with people. And the idea that, this is some invasion of trans people who are trying to win all the time and who are trying to take spots from people is just not the reality. And many of our cases, like a case that I'm not on, but it was a case called Sewell in Connecticut, where some cisgender girls sued their school over allowing transgender girls to participate. The cisgender girls had beat the transgender girls on numerous occasions. And so it is just silly, and it's just rooted in sexism and these beliefs about bodies and what bodies look like. And again, for cisgender women too, our bodies span the spectrum in terms of height, in terms of weight, in terms of muscle build, in terms of all of these things. There are so many factors that determine sort of what your body is going to look like. And again, it is low-hanging fruit that people can use to target an extremely vulnerable population who already have to go through so much to just quite literally be themselves, and who just want to have the same opportunities as every other student in school. And so that's what we're fighting for, and what I think about every day. Now, I'll say when I first started doing these cases, I was like, I hate sports. Like, I would never, but at the same time, I mean, it reminds me of when I was working on the military cases. It's not about that. It is truly, truly, truly about the opportunity. And it's about, again, if that person is interested in those things and that is available to every other student, why are you foreclosing that opportunity for transgender students? Because of bias, because of pseudoscience, because of just misbeliefs and just ignorance at the end of the day. And we just can't let those kinds of things stand. And so it's very, very important that we litigate these issues. And again, we're coming up in a defensive posture because these states are just passing these laws and they just have no basis. And thankfully, the courts have sided with us. In our West Virginia case, we were granted a preliminary injunction striking down West Virginia's prohibition of trans girls participating in girls' sports. And we feel confident. The same thing happened in our Hecox case, which was out in Idaho. And the courts are seeing these for exactly what they are. And again, it's just hateful discrimination, and it just has no place in society.
Are you using the same legal strategy on each of these cases? Like, is there a specific way that you're kind of entering into your argument?
Absolutely. I mean, the claims at heart are ultimately the same kind of claims that we've been advancing in a number of cases: equal protection, Title IX, the education amendments, and some privacy claims in some instances where schools are doing or proposing invasive, sort of what I want to call it, invasive sort of test to show that you truly are male or female, and just very odd things to get students to do. And so, yeah, so we do use the same legal strategy throughout the cases, which is helpful because that's sort of how impact litigation works. We get a legal theory, we build it up in multiple jurisdictions, and thankfully a lot of those jurisdictions are agreeing. And it was the same way for bathrooms. well, it was until the 11th Circuit decided to take a case called Adams v. School Board of St. Johns County en banc, and they'll be hearing that case in February, and that is also dealing with transgender students' access to bathrooms in relation to their gender identity. But yeah, the strategies that we use are built on the back of sex discrimination that was brought on behalf of primarily cisgender women. And so we have expanded that into the space because sexual, like the Supreme Court said in Bostock, sexual orientation and gender identity are inherent to sex. There's just no way you can get around those things without discussing it. And so, yeah, those legal strategies are being employed in a variety of our cases.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Asaf, I want to turn to you and ask a little bit. What I want to do is first open up the idea of gender affirming healthcare. What is that? Can you describe, just so that our audience has a place to land, what is gender affirming healthcare?
Sure. When we talk about gender affirming healthcare, we're talking about a variety of healthcare services or things that trans non-binary young people do to treat their gender dysphoria. And it could mean anything from what was typically referred to as a social transition, so that they're using a new name, new pronouns, maybe they're wearing different clothing or have a different hairstyle, to medications, to even surgeries. And all these steps are taken, again, to treat their gender dysphoria, and that is gender affirming healthcare.
And what sorts of attacks have we seen on gender affirming healthcare? I think it's a big range.
Yeah, we've really seen a wide range, and I think, like even going back to the bathroom bills that Haley talked about, and I think it's also important to point out that some of the tactics we're seeing in the anti-trans healthcare space or anti-trans space, or some we're seeing just in the abortion access space too. So a lot of these bills often started out as like a bounty, where people who reported that a trans person was using the restroom consistent with their gender identity would be able to get some amount of money, very similar to what we're seeing in the Texas law around abortion access. And so it started with those bills, which again really seek to interfere with the trans person's ability to be themselves in school. And now it's turned into more explicit attacks on criminalizing medical and mental health providers in actually providing the care that is consistent with the standard of care, right? This is like the only area of law where the lawmakers are saying, no, you can't practice your trade consistent with the well-established standards of care. You must do things that we know to be harmful to transgender young people in particular. And I think what is really, I think, critical also to point out about the context is that they're doing this in a context where the standard of care is very clear, it's well established. In the sports context, state athletic associations have been developing trans-inclusive policies for decades, and state legislators are just ignoring that expertise and saying, no, we're going to just go the opposite direction. And so I think that is, that's why we're seeing the really incredible response we're seeing from the courts. But I think the attack on transition-related care touches on everything.
Yeah. Haley, I want to get back to some intersections. And you had mentioned earlier the repeal of the so-called Walking While Trans law, and that brought up, some intersectional impacts right around that law. But I think your work has touched on other intersections as well. And so I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about the repeal of that law, but really what impact it had on trans youth of color? Like, how did that intersection of race and gender identity really show up in that particular instance?
Sure. So these expansive loitering laws that are often called bans on walking while trans, that's because just monumentally and disproportionately the impact of the discretionary law enforcement attention and profiling is on trans people, usually women of color, including youth of color who are gender non-conforming. I mean, sometimes like it could be middle schoolers or high schoolers or young people a little older. And the overwhelming reports of the use of this law in New York, the one that was repealed, is that these laws are used as sort of stop and frisk 2.0 for policing young people in the streets, and actually some of the material that led up to the New York repeal put that out like florid clarity. So the New York legislators who repealed the law themselves definitely target trans women and women of color, and that repealing it would help marginalized communities that were already being unfairly targeted. And they specified that harassment was prompted by the law, including the fact that police officers themselves testified that they were being trained to look for women with Adam's apples that were pronounced, or women with big hands and big feet, and that during 4 years of one study of the impact of the law, 85% of the people who were arrested were Black and Latina. And that this was often done in sweeps where the officers were just arresting large numbers of women in a particular area at the same time. So striking these laws removes immense harm from what is a systemically oppressive legal environment. And I'm just struck by how often young people we serve who are LGBTQ will say that they want to be seen for who they are, and that there's an inherent sort of dignity and respect that goes with that in recognizing identity and having people be free to be who they are and to express it in some of the ways that Asaf talked about. You know, people transition, they're expressing themselves differently in the world, and to be seen in a way that builds them up in the world and is part of being in the world in a healthy way, rather than being seen in ways that are either criminalized or, and we see this a lot for our young people, hypersexualized, where just expressing yourself through your appearance and your manner gets read as sexual activity, sexual behavior, something that is or is verging on something that's illegal. And then we see the path to actually criminalizing it. And earlier when we were talking about how young people are treated in schools if they're, you know, blocked from bathroom access, like Taylor, you're talking about that. Part of what happens, part of the consequence of being made to feel uncomfortable, including physically uncomfortable, like not being able to relieve yourself in a safe space, leads to students being pushed out of schools. And when they're pushed out of the schools and onto the streets, that's another opportunity for profiling and an early connection with the criminal legal system, juvenile legal system, or criminal legal system that puts people on the path known as the school to prison pipeline, where our young people, often at the intersections of racial and gender oppression, who are made uncomfortable or actually forced out of school, get policed and build up criminal records rather than school records. And it's like multiple off ramps being imposed on people for who they are. And at core, that's what we're fighting against.
Yeah, it's so reminiscent of, you know, we do at MIS, we have a project that focuses on girls and their leadership and their liberation. And so much of the research around girls of color is very similar to, you know, raises many of the same issues that you were just talking about, Haley. Andy, I'm wondering if I can ask at Tildev how you have looked or what you have seen at this intersection of gender, race, and youth. I feel like, you know, the school to prison pipeline is the obvious kind of place, and I saw you nodding, you know, that is one of the real activation points, but I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what you've seen across your institution.
I think there are two examples that I can point to, and they're really tied to the legal services that we offer at TILDAF. First, in our name change project, which works to provide pro bono counsel to predominantly low-income trans and non-binary folks in the community in order for them to legally change their names. Many of our clients that come through our doors, the proverbial doors, are, over half, 50% of them identify as being on the spectrum of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, or people of color, and more than half live under the federal poverty line of less than $12,000 a year. Many of these folks are young folks. I would say that for TILDEF would be under the age of probably 24 and under. But many of these folks experience a number of the disparities that we constantly hear about and read reports one after another. They're housing insecure. Their parents kick them out of their homes. They often have to turn to public benefits or the social safety net in order to survive on a day-to-day basis. These are the folks that are accessing, fundamentally, I think, an earlier form of legal recognition of who they are. Simply having your name changed and your gender marker changed in your state documents, it's a fundamental step for a trans or non-binary person to take in being able to transition and live as their authentic selves. I think particular for our name change clients, I'm often reminded of one of my first years on the job and how there was the parent of an 8-year-old trans girl of color who walked through our door and was seeking assistance in being able to file a name change on behalf of their 8-year-old daughter. This was a parent that was living in a women's shelter, had very little access to the kinds of things that I think many of us would consider to be easy to access, whether it's finding an attorney, finding resources, being able to even go on the internet, having a reliable internet connection. And this is that parent and her trans daughter speaks to the kind of disparities and trauma that we see walk through our doors day in and day out. I also think about our health project, and many of our clients either have access to a Medicaid plan that's administered under their state, or that they receive if they're lucky enough to be able to work for a private employer. They usually have access to a small group employer plan. In both of those instances, trans-related healthcare coverage is dismal. State Medicaid plans vary in terms of the coverage that they offer. And when we talk about small group employer plans, they often offer the very baseline of coverage for gender affirming care available to trans folks. So I'll close out by saying that when you take into consideration a person's gender identity, we're often denied access to basic services. When you take into account a person's gender identity and their race or ethnicity, it's far worse. It's compounded discrimination. And we know that because of a person's gender identity and their race or ethnicity, you're not only not able to access those kinds of critical supports, but you're often denied them.
Thank you. So many of you have talked about how the legal issues kind of intersect, and I want to come back to you, Asaf, and you raised this actually in your introduction a little bit, talking about how access to healthcare and correct gender markers and documentation, like all of those things kind of fit together. And we've talked a little bit about the DT versus Christ case, but there may be a better example. Can you give us an example of a case where you're seeing multiple issues kind of, and you're having to argue kind of in a fact pattern that involves multiple sites of attack on a trans youth?
Yeah, I think actually DT is a great example of that, just because we're talking about young people who, as a result of not being able to get a corrected birth certificate, are experiencing barriers in so many different aspects of their life, right? They, whether those barriers are, their school won't change their school records, and so their school records continue to out them and as a result, the students continue to get bullied and harassed in school, to the students, these young people saying, I would love to play basketball, I'd love to play volleyball or soccer or whatever, but I won't sign up because I know I have to show my birth certificate in order to register. And I don't want to play, based on what's on my birth certificate. I want to play based on who I am. And so, I think it's affecting multiple parts of their lives. And I think the other piece of this is too, that we're also seeing one of our clients, Helen Rowe, which is a pseudonym, is a trans girl of color. And she has experienced, harassment, even though she's 8 years old. And, one of the things that her parents are concerned about in seeking to ensure that she has a corrected birth certificate is to safeguard her from hopefully safeguard her from the disproportionate amount of violence and discrimination that trans women of color experience, right? Having those identity documents reflect who she is will ensure that she can, walk through her life without having to disclose that she's transgender unless she chooses to do so. And that is a real point of safety for her, and also, again, ensures that she has the same ability to access and do the things that all kids get to do, right? She just wants to be a kid. And so
I just want to interrupt. I'm really sorry to do it. I warned you that I might have to. I'm going to announce the CLE code. And then I want to, Asaf, if it's okay, I just come right back to you here. And we'll have a slide come up that shows you the code. But the CLE code is WMG19. That's WMG19. All right, and we'll get back into Asaf. I'm sorry about having to just do that public service announcement, but we can get back to you now.
No. I mean, I think, and as Andy pointed out, having access to those key documents is really, it can affect your ability to seek jobs. It can affect your ability to obtain healthcare. I mean, I think, each of us has stories of, where we worked with a client to change this one thing, right? Get their name and gender marker change corrected, to get access to healthcare, to get access to restrooms, and their entire outlook on life changed. Their entire ability to participate in day-to-day life changed, right? Just as an example, we worked on a restroom case with a young person in Florida who went from almost failing his sophomore year to going on to honor roll his junior and senior year. And for the first time started talking about going to college. Right? I mean, these are seemingly small things that have a tremendous impact on the life of the person you're working with. And by increasing access to folks generally, has that same effect writ large.
Thank you. So, a question I often hear from folks in different places who feel like, maybe they're a little bit separated from the movement, but they care passionately is, what can I do about this? What can I actually do about this? And so I wondered if any of you might share how you see members of trans youth community, whether it's parents, coaches, spiritual community, whatever it is, how are you seeing community members step up to be helpful in these situations in which trans young people find themselves? And I'll call on somebody, but if you have a thought in mind, feel free to jump in.
Well, I am struck by how people can use their voices, but I mean, sometimes there are designated public hearings, opportunities. Now in the age of Zoom, sometimes it's an opportunity that you can take virtually, you can write in. I mean, contact legislators. Do not discount the power of raising your voice. There are professional opportunities and associations that generate reports, and for students out there looking to go into the legal profession, student memberships to associations. But I also think of just learning bystander intervention techniques and going to trainings by an organization like Hollaback that will teach you to have at the fore ways to respond, whether it's distracting from somebody who is being harassed and distracting the harasser, or taking them on. And this could be in a formal situation or informally, to say that's not my experience, or I wonder why you say that, or I disagree. I mean, there are techniques, and if you practice them, they can be exercised interpersonally and they can be exercised professionally, and they all sort of rhyme once you get familiar with them. You know, there are ways to elevate them into testimony, and there are ways to use them on the subway. And so I really urge people to get that training and then see where it will take you. And I, Flag being a parent, and one of my cisgender girls just told me a couple of weeks ago, she got off the subway and she was being harassed, and she turned around and said to some guy, "Don't touch me," very loudly. And I had sent her to the Center for Anti-Violence Education when she was in 7th grade. And she's like, "Wow, that really comes back." So practical skills deployed at all levels.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much. Taylor.
Yeah, I think about, like, when I think about this, and I think about specifically trans youth and sort of the people that they interact with the most, obviously, I think schools. I've done a lot of work with GLSEN on a variety of different bases, but I think that teachers who display some kind of inclusive, I mean, for trans people, it's obviously there's a trans flag, things like that. I think it's so important for trans youth to know that there's somebody that they can come and talk to, especially about these issues. And I think that goes all the way through college, to be completely honest, because, these are just some of your most formative years, and you're dealing with some of the biggest changes in your life and things that are going to impact you for the rest of your life. And so I really think teachers have a big role in doing that. Same for parents. Even if you don't have transgender children, you need to teach your children manners. I mean, like, I hate to say that. I mean, I'm Southern, but it's like manners are a very big thing. And I think part of that is teaching that people are different. People, people come in all shapes and sizes and colors and what have you. And so I think having a discussion about race, having a discussion about trans people, having a discussion about LGBT people is so important, because you don't want your kid to be that bully at school. You don't want your kid to be, that bad kid at school who is potentially causing a child to take their life, or potentially causing a child distress because they're bullying them. And so there's a really big responsibility, I think, that parents of cisgender children do have, because, as we know, they are the majority. We can't fight the stats. And so that's the advice that I would give, especially, and on top of everything that Haley said, but especially teachers in schools. I think they have such a big role and are really, like, the job for children, because they spend their lives there like 8 hours a day, like we do at work. Well, at this job, it's like 24 hours a day. But yeah, so that's what I think. Schools, like, and parents, just be open about these things and talk to your kids.
Thank you. I'm curious about medical professionals. Have you seen them step up, Asaf or Andy? Have you seen them step up in ways that have been really helpful? Or not?
Well, I guess I'll say, I think one of the things that I was really amazed to see and really happy to see, particularly in this latest round of attacks on trans young people, is how many people did step up, right? And how many parents went to testify, how many doctors and healthcare providers went to testify. And really, even if unsuccessful, like in the case of Arkansas, got folks' attention. I mean, Governor Hutchinson went on national television and said that this bill is cruel. And so I think that was not insignificant as a result of the organizing that occurred around those bills, that was involved many young people. And I think, we saw even governors kind of stand down and say, I can't sign these bills because of the wonderful sort of things that trans young people did to get out there and actually humanize who they are. Because I think that's really what, as folks were mentioning earlier, they have no connection to trans people. They're just doing this because, it's a sort of political wedge issue. So I think a lot of folks really did come out in support. And I think that's something that we're gearing up for another legislative session, and we're going to, I'm sure, need those folks to come back and continue to speak up and support young people in continuing to get out there and get their voices out there. And I think, for folks who are interested in getting involved, I think just find a way that works for you. right? For the law students, I'm sure that legal organizations would benefit from, research assistance. If you're at a law firm, try and co-counsel and do pro bono work. I mean, there's small things like helping someone navigate a name and gender marker change is life-changing. And it's something you can do so easily. And frankly, time and money, to the extent that you find organizations whose mission you believe in, dedicate to investing in those organizations, because there is an onslaught coming yet again, and it's really critical that organizations have the resources to respond, because we know that organizations pushing these bills are very well funded. And not only are we trying to defeat these bills in the state legislatures, but then also having to prepare to challenge them in the courts if we're unsuccessful. And so I think that takes incredible amounts of resources, both human and otherwise.
I also urge people with privilege of any kind, and many of the people in our virtual room, I'm sure, have it on some level, or maybe several, to realize they have it and get comfortable with learning and with not necessarily always being 100% right, and being called on that and course correcting. So I think it's incumbent on us to educate ourselves, going out there to do our advocacy in whatever part, and also to not be stopped by a critique or a course correction that is offered or feedback, and to be resilient enough to go ahead and keep doing the work and improving oneself, because packing it in if one is course corrected or critiqued is just, I call that taking your privileged toys and go at home. And that is an exercise of supremacy, which we shouldn't engage in. So like, recognize it for what it is, take the feedback, educate yourself, take the feedback, continue to grow, and don't take your privileged toys and go home, because the work needs you, the people need you. And if you really care, you're going to keep putting yourself out there.
Thank you all so much. I want to raise up one point that was made earlier in the chat and I just missed it, but just as we can all show up as our best selves, and Haley, as you said, like really focus on, where do I have privilege in my cisgender person? Where do I have privilege and how am I exercising it? And what are the opportunities for feedback coming at me in the world, and how can I educate myself? It's also true that it's not just legislators that are causing the harm, right? It is people across the board causing the harm. It's insurance companies causing the harm. And so if we do step into doing our most here instead of our least, and being our best instead of our worst, we actually we are all critical to making the difference in this particular issue and across social justice spaces, of course. I want to close this and then hand it back to my colleagues at Birnbaum. But I just want to close this with a thank you to the plaintiffs. Sam opened us beautifully with a reminder that there are people behind these names on either side of the V. And in the case of these people, there are very, very young people in many cases involved in this fight. And what they are offering up is sometimes a portion of their life that you don't get back. You don't get your teens back. You don't get elementary school back. And when this, being involved in a litigation has colored that portion of your life experience, that's a really huge thing to be giving all of us towards our liberation. So a deep, deep thought and feeling of gratitude to the plaintiffs, and of course to all of you for the wonderful, wonderful work you're doing. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. And I'm going to hand it back to Madeline Guri at Birnbaum to close us.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you so much to all the panelists, and what a fabulous discussion. Thanks, Ruth, for your moderating. I just want to thank the Miss Foundation and Outlaw for co-sponsoring tonight's conversation. And thank you to our audience members for joining us tonight. I'm Madeline Jory, the Interim Executive Director at the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network. And we hope you'll join us for some of our other upcoming events, including parts 2 and 3 of this speaker series. Those will be on the Equal Rights Amendment in the 21st Century, which will be in February 2022, and A Path Forward, Where Do We Go From Here, in April 2022. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful evening.